Flawedcast, episode 190, The United Fascistic States of America. Fascism is a religious concept. Benito Mussolini.
Flawedcast, get in the arena.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of our esteemed, blessed, highly favored Flawedcast Nation, Flawedcast listeners. Want to welcome everyone back to a brand new, hopefully educational and thought-provoking episode. I am manning the station alone this week, so you're going to have to put up with my tomfoolery and my shenanigans, but continue to pray for Carl and with what's going on with him. And I have on good confidence that those of you who enjoy hearing Mrs. Smith's massive and important contributions are in favored good fortunes, because she shall be making a return soon to the world of Flawedcast. So keep an eye out for that. But that being said, just want to encourage you guys to please share with your friends, your neighbors, your parents, people at your churches, whomever. We're asking that you help us spread the word and share these things that I believe God's sharing with us, or at least pointing out to me in regards to timely and spiritual topics. And I'm going to hopefully get into that in a little bit more here. But you can find us anywhere podcasts are. We're on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Breaker, Anchor.fm. We're anywhere you can find podcasts. We're also on the video platform Rumble. That's under Flawed Inc. You could also find us on the Project Mockingbird social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, also on Getter and Gab. That's under Flawed Inc. In the description, there is a link. You can pick up a copy of my book, Smith's Heart of Man Repair Manual. And our email is flawedinc@gmail.com. Any questions, comments, or concerns, I will shoot that on up the chain of command to Mrs. Smith, and she will deal with them and you accordingly. So I'm going to get into something interesting here, and I think it's somewhat timely, and I think it's somewhat important to discuss things of a historical nature, but also on an intellectual, logical level, especially, in regards to things that are spiritual or things that may not seem spiritual. We are surrounded by a supernatural world. We are natural beings and we live in a natural world, but we are surrounded, inundated, influenced, and just consumed, depending on your point of view or your stance, by the supernatural surroundings all around us. And it's important to keep in mind that as we look at things going forward and as we look at things, historically, there's a pattern in regard to political systems. And, we're going to be talking about fascism. I came across a really riveting article I'm going to talk about in a moment, but regarding politics, we need to be primarily focused on the politics of the kingdom of heaven. Juxtaposition of that, there is the politics of the kingdom of darkness, which we need to understand how our enemy operates in a large way so that we understand how we can offensively maneuver and take ground and not allow them to manipulate or to harm. And, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God, and we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. However, there are things in place that on a natural level we have to be educated on and we have to know about. And I came across this article from a woman named Naomi Wolf. It's called Fascist America and 10 Easy Steps. And I'm going to get into that. But I want to really kind of talk about the idea of fascism, because terms like fascism or socialism or communism or Marxism are very easily thrown around and oftentimes are kind of indistinguishable. So even before we go into talking about fascism in America, I want to lay a clear understanding or a clear foundation of what we're actually going to be talking about. And I found this definition on Brainly.com. on an article titled "What is the Difference Between Fascism, Marxism, Communism, and Socialism?" It says here, fascism, Marxism, communism, and socialism are all political ideologies that have influenced the development of societies throughout our history. While they share some similarities, there are key differences between them. So let's just dive into fascism. Fascism is an authoritarian and nationalistic ideology that emphasizes the centralized power of the state. It often promotes a single leader or dictator and seeks to suppress opposition and dissent. Fascist governments prioritize the nation or race above the rights of individuals. Examples of this would be Hitler's Nazi Germany or Benito Mussolini's, how he controlled Italy during his time during World War II. So regarding fascism, and this is why, people might, for example, call Trump a fascist, not really looking at the holistic view of what a fascist is. And this is important that we kind of spend a little time and understand this. They're saying that the idea of fascism is a nation or a country government controlled by one person, one leader, and it seeks to oppress, or it seeks to silence, it seeks to imprison, cause harm to dissent or to people that oppose that leader or oppose those policies. And the key thing, and this is why, like, even with Trump, like he is racist. He wants to close the border. And now, years later, we have an invasion. So it's very easy to look at something and see that, this leader is a fascist or this policy is fascistic. But we really need to, in lieu of history, and what the actual definition of, look at what a fascist is and what a fascistic governmental state actually does. So moving on, we're going to go to Marxism, which is a socioeconomic theory developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It focuses on the struggle between the working class, the proletariat, and the owning class, the bourgeois. Marx believed that the inevitable outcome of this class struggle would be a revolution leading to the establishment of a classless society. Marxism also advocates for the abolition of private property and the means of production being controlled by the workers. However, there have been different interpretations of Marxism, leading to variation in its implementation. So this one, it's almost like an oxymoron, because there's the classes, but ultimately the idea is that it wants to become a classless society. So you have the proletariat, you have the bourgeois, you have the haves and have-nots, if you will. And eventually, through some kind of uprising, some kind of revolution, there's going to inevitably be a classless society, which means everyone's going to be on a equal playing field. I don't understand how that happens unless it's a violent revolution, and I think you maybe have seen that throughout history. And oddly enough, there are a lot of historians or researchers who wrote books. One that's interesting is by a gentleman named Richard Wurmbrand, and it's called "Was Karl Marx a Satanist?" And Marx had he has like poetry and art and a lot of his speeches that may allude to that. And I became aware of this book a little bit ago, so I haven't really had an opportunity to read it and to get into it, but the idea is certainly thought-provoking, and I would really like the opportunity to kind of dive into that a little more. So if somebody would be interested in getting that book and reading it and let me know their thoughts, I would certainly be interested in that. But let's move along, and we're going to next visit the idea of communism, which is a political ideology derived from Marxism. It advocates for a classless society where the means of production are commonly owned and resources are distributed according to individuals' needs. In practice, communism aims to create a society without social classes, private property, or money. Some examples of countries that have attempted to implement communism include the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, China under Mao Zedong, and then Cuba under Fidel Castro. And I would just say, historically, how did that work out? Interestingly enough, communism trickles downwards from Marxism, but Marxism being a socioeconomic theory, and this is a political ideology. So Marxism is more encompassing of culture and society, where communism is just installed as a political ideology, which you don't have to change the hearts and minds of people. You just persuade them by the end of a gun. So we're going to talk about socialism, which is an economic and political ideology that seeks to create a more equitable society by distributing wealth and ensuing public control over resources and industries. Unlike communism, socialism does not aim to abolish private property entirely. Instead, it advocates for collective ownership of likely industries and the provision of social welfare programs. Socialism could take different forms and degrees, ranging from democratic socialism to more entirely panned systems. Examples of socialist policies can be seen in the likes of Sweden, Normandy, and Denmark. And I've always heard and taught the difference primarily between socialism and communism is that communism is implemented by at the end of a gun. And socialism isn't. So it's all this euphoric, hippy-dippy pie in the sky, I would say, kind of nonsense. And interestingly enough, we're going to be talking about fascism in America, but America has certainly adopted many socialistic ideas, especially in regards to the redistribution of wealth and help programs and stuff by the government, which during the wheatless and meatless program, FDR around the time of the Great Depression implemented. And, oddly enough, FDR found great admiration from guys like Benito Mussolini and Stalin and even Hitler to a degree because of his implementation of these kind of programs that we are, now seeing, where people who are invading our border are now being put up in these really lavish settings, and veterans in America are kind of being kicked to the wayside. But nonetheless, I'm going to get into this article. And as I'm reading this, what impressed me is as I heard Naomi Wolf speak, and I heard her on an interview on InfoWars, and learning more about her, she was a Clinton aide. She used to work with Hillary Clinton. She was very involved in the Democratic Party, and somehow got awakened to what was going on. And she wrote this article. This appeared in The Guardian, the London Guardian, in 2007, April 24th, 2007 to be exact. And at the time, the article was written as a sharp critique of the Bush administration, the W. Bush. And I certainly think there is plenty of room for that. And what I've done is I've gone through the article and I've read it, and I'm just going to highlight the things that are evergreen, the things that were current then and that are current now. And as I'm reading this, I challenge you with an open mind and with, maybe removing our rose-colored lenses, if we have them, to look and see if any of this sticks, if any of this applies. And I think you do. And then I want to get into some other things at the end, but I believe we're going to find out that a lot of this stuff is antithetical to the heart of the gospel. So let's just kind of dive into this, and there's 10 easy steps. We're just going to go through the steps. So the first one says, invoke a terrifying internal and external enemies. So there's danger from within and then from without. Says, after we were hit on September 11, 2001, we were in a state of national shock. Less than 6 weeks later, on October 26, 2001, the USA Patriot Act was passed by Congress that had little chance to debate it. Many said that they scarcely had time to read it. We were told we were now on a war footing, quote unquote. We were in a, quote unquote, global war against a, quote, global caliphate, end quote, including to wipe out civilization. Bruce Fein of the American Freedom Agenda notes it's unprecedented. All our other wars had an endpoint, so the pendulum was able to swing back towards freedom. This war is defined as open-ended in time and without national boundaries in space. The globe itself is the battlefield. This time, Fein said, there will be no defined end. Creating a terrifying threat, a Hydra-like secretive evil, is an old trick. Invocation of communist threat to the national security be based on actual events of the Reichstag fire of February 1933, which we've talked about before, was swiftly followed in Nazi Germany by passage of the Enabling Act, which replaced constitutional law with an open-ended state of emergency, or the terrifying threat that can be based, like the National Socialist revocation of the globe conspiracy of Jewry, is a myth. So what they're saying is they create this boogeyman, a threat inside and outside, and it is everywhere, anywhere. It knows no boundaries, knows no borders, knows no creed, nationality, race, any of that, no religious affiliation, although at that time when the Patriot Act was passed, it certainly was focused towards Muslims. But now we're still under that unconstitutional act, and I personally believe it's a gross oversight of our personal and civil rights. But they created this boogeyman, and the fact that 9/11, in large regard, still is not able to have an open conversation about it being an inside job, which I think there's decent enough evidence to at least have a intellectual conversation without really being, how to say, triggered. And not that it wasn't horrific events, but at some point when you go to the doctor and you're not feeling well, we have to have an open conversation about, this is the problem. How do we deal with it and move forward? So that's the first step. Having a boogeyman, having a monster that is a threat internally and externally, with no boundaries, no end date, no set goal, that once we achieve this goal, that war, that caliphate has ended. So it perpetually goes. The second thing is we create a gulag. So once you have gotten everyone scared, the next step is to create a prison system outside the rule of law. At first, the people who are sent there are seen by citizens and outsiders. They're troublemakers. They're spies or enemies of the people, enemies of the state, or even animals. Initially, citizens tend to support the secret prison system that makes them feel safe, and they do not identify with the prisoners. But soon enough, civil society leaders, opposition members, labor activists, clergy, and journalists are arrested and sent there as well. This process took place in the fascistic shifts, anti-democracy crackdown, as ranging from Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s to Latin America coups of the 1970s and beyond. It is standard practice for closing down an open society or crushing a pro-democracy uprising. At this time, we can certainly look towards Guantanamo Bay, but now I think a really good example would be that there's people still sitting in prison from the quote-unquote January 6th uprising, which it's nonsense. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be offensive, but from the perspective of people in America who are trying to understand things and trying to be awake, there's been no due process. There's been no, constitutionally protected rights that are been served to these people that are still sitting in jail. And for those who aren't aware, a gulag is a prison. During that time, during the early 2000s, right after September 11, 2001, Guantanamo Bay, you may remember famously. I often think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which is a fantastic read, very heavy, but fantastic. And basically, he was a Russian general, and he had letters to home during World War II that were intercepted, and the Soviet Union thought he was a traitor and threw him in a gulag, threw him in a prison. And so it's creating this prison system where at first you paint people to be villains, and they very well, in most cases, probably are. However, it's a slippery slope. It's a red herring, and eventually you see the villainization of opposition to the majority. You see journalists, and the most striking thing here to me is clergy. And you certainly see that, and I think it's just something to be aware of. Now, number 3, we develop a thug caste. So when leaders who seek what I call a, quote, fascistic shift, end quote, want to close down an open society, they send paramilitary groups of scary young men out to terrorize citizens. The black shirts roamed the Italian countryside, beating up communists. The brown shirts staged violent rallies throughout Germany. This paramilitary force is especially important to a democracy. You need citizens to fear thug violence, and so you need thugs who are free from prosecution. After Hurricane Katrina, the Department of Homeland Security hired and deployed hundreds of armed private security guards in New Orleans. The investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill interviewed one armed guard who reported having fired on unarmed civilians in the city. So what we see here with that thug cast, I would harken back to, the summer of 2000, the summer of love, with Antifa attacks, BLM attacks, Nancy Pelosi calling MS-13 God's children. Things of that nature where, and if you don't know who the black shirts and the brown shirts were, please do a little research. They were a powerful ploy, much in the way that Antifa and BLM and some of these other entities have been and how they've been used to create fear into the general public, to create a heightened sense of awareness and paranoia that is being artificially created and artificially manipulated. Now, number 4, set up an internal surveillance system. In Mussolini's Italy, in Nazi Germany, in Communist East Germany, in Communist China, in America, one could argue, in every closed society, secret police spy on ordinary people and encourage neighbors to spy on neighbors. The Stasi needed to keep only a minority of East Germans under surveillance to convince a majority that they themselves are being watched. In closed societies, this surveillance is cast as being about national security. The true function is to keep citizens docile and inhibit their activism and dissent. My thought would be during COVID, when it was incentivized that neighbors rat on neighbors if they don't have the vaccines, or, if they're going out unmasked, or if their children are unmasked. Promoting this idea of we are being surveillanced, and it's not even quote unquote Big Brother who's doing it. It's our neighbor who we've, had barbecue cookouts with, and, you talk as you see him over the fence. Hey, howdy ho there, neighbor. That surveillance state is being created. And once again, we see a downward trend. You have that thug caste system, you have this paranoia, and you see, that my neighbor's acting out of line. And you saw that during, the COVID pandemic, where people have become highly suspicious and they rat on one another. Number 5 is harass citizen groups. Now, number 4 and number 5 are kind of tied in together. It says people infiltrate and harass citizens groups. It can be the Rival, a church in Pasadena whose minister preached that Jesus was in favor of peace, found himself being investigated by the IRS. The American Civil Liberties Union reports that thousands of ordinary Americans' anti-war involvement in other groups have been infiltrated by agents. A secret Pentagon database includes more than 4 dozen peaceful and anti-war meetings, rallies, or marches by American citizens in its category of 1,500 suspicious incidents. The equally secret counterintelligence field active CIFA agents of the Department of Defense have been gathering information about domestic organizations engaged in peaceful political activities. CIFA is supposed to, quote, track individual terrorist threats, and it has watched ordinary U.S. citizen activists. A little notice law has redefined activism such as animal rights protests as quote-unquote terrorist. So the definition of a terrorist slowly expands to include opposition. And we see that when, Biden, O'Biden will say something to the effect of the greatest threat in America is white males, which statistically speaking are amongst some of the lowest in regards to crime across the board. I think of certainly the groups like the 912 group. I know people like Glenn Beck were behind. I know my Aunt Barb personally was affected by this in regards to the IRS coming after them and looking at them in regards to as a criminal, as an activist or a terrorist for just participating in their civil rights, their government protected, their constitutionally protected civil rights. And certainly, during Obama, during his administration, going after certain nonprofit groups, removing their status as a nonprofit, so on and so forth. But we see this is happening, and all of these things we discussed so far, there's examples previously and examples now that we see that we're just going down the rabbit hole. Number 6, engage in arbitrary detention and release. This scares people. It is kind of a cat and mouse game. In 2004, America's Transportation Security Administration confirmed that it had a list of passengers who were targeted for security searches or worse. If they tried to fly, it's a standard practice of fascistic societies that since you are on that list, you can't get off. So we see that, no-fly lists, things of that nature, where people are deemed an enemy of the state. And certainly there's a cause for being secure. And I'm thankful for the men and women who serve our country, who are first responders and who do protect us. But what I really want to emphasize and talk about is gross oversight, gross misuse of power, and how we can see this being implemented into everyday life in America. And I certainly think about January 6th, once again, going back to, what happened on that day, which was in many ways stupid and horrific. But what we see is that what has happened in lieu of that is a travesty of justice. And we just really need to take a look at these things. Why are people being detained? Is it a lawful thing, or is it subjective because we don't like these people's thoughts? We don't like their speech. That's dangerous, and it is unconstitutional. Number 7, target key individuals. Threaten civil servants, artists, and academics with job loss if they don't toe the line. Mussolini went after the rectors of state universities who did not conform to the fascistic line. So did Joseph Goebbels, who purged academics who were not pro-Nazi. So did Chile's Augusto Pinochet. So does Chinese Communist Proletariado in punishing pro-democracy students and professors. Since civil servants are the sector of society most vulnerable to being fired by a given regime, they are also a group that fascists, they coordinate early on. The Reich Law for Reestablishment of Professional Civil Service was passed April 7, 1933. Elsewhere, a civil contract worker who said in a closed blog that waterboarding is a torture was stripped of their security clearance in order to do her job. Most recently, the administration purged 8 U.S. attorneys for what looked like insufficient political loyalty. When Joseph Goebbels purged the civil service in 1933, attorneys were coordinated too, a step that eased the way for increasingly brutal laws to follow. And I think of guys like, Alex Jones. I think of like Donald Trump. I think of Tucker Carlson, the harassment he got for just interviewing Vladimir Putin. And you make these straw men, you make these individuals who may have an impact or who may be exposing things, and you villainize them. You make them the villain of the story, who are just simply bringing another perspective or shedding things to light. And that in and of itself is extremely dangerous. It's also a red herring, because these people that are in the position of power to do that are throwing common people off the scent. So it's easy to say things about a guy like Alex Jones, who doesn't have the legislative or judicial power, as somebody, like the president or vice president or senator, congressperson. And therein lies the danger of people in leadership over us. Gross misuse of power. Number 8, control the press. Italy in the 1920s, Germany in the 1930s, East Germany in the 1950s, Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, the Latin American dictatorships in the 70s, China in the 80s and 90s. All dictatorships and would-be dictators target newspapers and journalists. They threaten and harass them in more open societies that they are seeking to close, and they arrest them, and worse, in societies that have been closed already. Over time, in closing societies, real news is supplemented by fake news and false documents. In a fascistic system, it is not the lies that count, but the muddying of them. When citizens can't tell real news from fake, they give up their demands for accountability bit by bit. And certainly we can see all of the 3-letter news networks, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, CBN, like there is gross manipulation. And having been a journalist and being an entertainment journalist, there was very little in the way of political power, political threat in that regard. But there was a certain sway. So even at that level, and certainly in the level of swaying political context and swaying public opinion in regards to circumventing freedom and the processes that preserve it. Number 9, dissent equals treason. Cast dissent as treason and criticism as espionage. Every closing society does this, just as its elaborate laws that increasingly criminalize certain kinds of speech and expand the definition of spy and traitor. In every closed society, at a certain point, there are some high-profile arrests, usually of opposition leaders, clergy, and journalists. Then everything goes quiet. After these arrests, there are still newspapers, courts, TVs, and radios that facades of a civil society. There just isn't real dissent. There just isn't freedom. If you look at history just before those arrests, where are they now? And I would look at people like election theft deniers, maybe the Proud Boys, for example, and maybe going back to January 6th, people agreed, those people agreed, and I think certainly would say that I align with that in a large regards. The last election was stolen, and thusly I think most elections since 2018, certainly key races were stolen. But we do have a right in America to say that. We do have a right to produce evidence, and I think there's been plenty of evidence produced. But the idea is that you criminalize, you remove this dissent and let everything go on as normal. It removes it from people's memory. And I think in a large regard, we have seen that. And, there's such a big hubbub about this person or that group. And you just think, once again with the Proud Boys or Gavin McInnes, for example, where are they now? 10. Suspend the rule of law. The John Warner Defense Authorization Act of 2007 gave the president new powers over the National Guard. This means that in a national emergency, which the president now has enhanced powers to declare, he can send Michigan's militias to enforce a state emergency that he has declared in Oregon over the objections of the state's governors and its citizens. The New York Times editorialized about this shift. A disturbing recent phenomenon in Washington is that laws that strike to the heart of American democracy have been passed in the dead of night. Beyond actual insurrection, the president may now use military troops as a domestic police force in response to natural disaster, a disease outbreak, a terrorist attack, or any other condition. Critics see this as a violation of Posse Comitatus Act, which was meant to restrain the federal government from using the military for domestic law enforcement. The Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy says the bill encourages a president to declare federal martial law. It also violates the very reason the founders set up a system for government as they did, having been citizens bullied by a monarch's soldiers, the founders were terrified of exactly this kind of concentration of malicious power over American people in the hands of oppressive executive or factions. So what I would say about that is certainly you can look as an example of right now, New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, the National Guard are being called out in their subways and on the street to monitor people's travel. The idea that California National Guard can be brought to Ohio, which are complete different demographics. And, one would think that if there's a crisis in Ohio, you would bring the Ohio National Guard. And even against the Ohio, in that regard, say Mike DeWine, who's now the governor of Ohio, says, no, I don't want the California National Guard here. The president, according to this, has the right to override that. And vice versa. If Gavin Newsom's like, no, I don't want Ohio National Guardsmen here, the president can override that. And I know that there's even been talks about removing the Insurrection Act, which was last used by George H.W. Bush during the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So it's like it works in reverse, because if Trump gets elected, I don't know, but if he does get elected and then, all hell breaks loose, according to that, he's not going to have the right to call up National Guard in different states. So it's a fine-edged sword, and it's funny how this article was written in 2007 and how many things may remain the same, but a lot of things have changed. And I just want us to think about all that. And it's a lot. Please go read the article for yourself. I'll put a link in the description. But I want to read a Bible verse here. Mark 12:28-33 from the Amplified Bible. It says, "Then one of the scribes, an expert of Mosaic law, came up and listened to them arguing with one another. And noticing that Jesus answered them well, he asked, 'Which commandment is first and most important of all?' Jesus answered, 'The first and most important one is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, life, and with all your mind, thought, and understanding, and with all of your strength. This is the second. You shall unselfishly love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.'" Certainly, I would say in regards to the spiritual, the religious aspect, all these governmental systems are against the idea of loving your neighbor unselfishly above yourself, and then even loving God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, because that is a threat to the idea of a centralized power. So if we're talking about a fascist dictator, the threat of worshiping Christ, who is the King of Kings, is contrary to their idea of being able to maintain their control and their charge over a country. So just something to think about, even in your own life and when your own dealings in society, just think about, like, are we going down this path? Certainly martial law, I think, is an ever-looming threat, especially as we're growing closer to the elections. And I think as, we just saw the death of the Iranian president, the assassination attempt on the Slovakian prime minister, where we just saw that Benjamin Netanyahu, by the World Court, is having war crime charges brought against him. We certainly see that there's a positioning for a possible escalation into World War IV. And I say that because a lot of people claim that the Cold War was World War III. So whatever you want to call it, I certainly see that the need for America to be subjugated and to fall. And I think that is the final pragmatic step before the Antichrist governmental system is able to fully take over. So this was a heavy episode, a lot to think about, a lot to process. I didn't do an episode last week because I needed to think about this stuff. I needed to process it and put this all together. But think about it, pray about it. And, you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know. But I certainly think it's a place that we need to start having discussions about. So I'm going to, just say a quick prayer and end this. So, Father, I just thank you for the opportunity to speak to people. And I ask that, as your word says, that your people perish for a lack of knowledge, I ask that you would just come and show things to people that no man, no woman are able to, that you would speak to the hearts of people better than I can, and that you would introduce ideas of love and compassion, complete surrender to you and the lordship of Jesus Christ, and then unselfishly loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. And I just thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. So please share this. You can find us anywhere podcasts are under Flawedcast, CLE, Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Breaker. We're on Anchor.fm as well. You can find us on the video platform Rumble under Flawed Inc. You can find us on the Project Mockingbird social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're on Getter and Gab as well, all under Flawed Inc. There is a link in the description below to get a copy of my book, Smith's Heart of Man Repair Manual. Our email is flawedinccle@gmail.com. And I just want to thank you guys, and hey, keep your head on a swivel and just be observant of what's going on and who is saying and doing what, and if they are walking the walk or just talking the talk.